Hey everyone, it's Pinnaker from Rock Daydream Nation, and I've got a very special guest to the show, the wonderful John Sinclair. John played in some very famous bands, Uriah Heep, Heavy Metal Kids, and he was also the keyboardist for Ozzy Osbourne. How's it going, John?
I'm doing good, Peter. How's it going over there? Good?
Fantastic, fantastic, and really appreciate your time. I know you don't do many interviews, so I feel really honoured. We do an ongoing sort of series on classic rock bands, and Uriah Heep is one that I've done quite a few times. And I'm doing a little bit of a show about Abominog, and I thought nothing like talking to a person that actually played on the album. So,
Cool. Cool.
yeah,
It was a great period. That's one of the things. Abominog, I've got to say, Pete, it was one of the periods I'm happy to talk about, because it was a great period. I mean, it's a really close band. Everything about it was great. And as I said previously, all the pennies fell in the slot just right. The relationships were great. Pete Golby was great. Mickey Box was great. Lee Kerslake was great. Bob Daisley was great. Actually, Hal, the producer, was great. And it's just, it just worked. It just worked. And it sort of kind of fell together from serendipity, really. Just day one, yeah.
Yeah. How did you get the gig with Heep?
Well, I was in a band called the Heavy Metal Kids, and we supported Uriah Heep. It was as simple as that. And we went out on tour, and I was a big fan of Heep. I loved Ken Hensley, and I suppose Ken was kind of in the. I mean, it wasn't. I wouldn't say it was the next generation, but he was that little bit older than me, maybe 5 or 6 years. But of course, 5 or 6 years is the difference between 13 and 18. Well, it doesn't make much. I'm 71 now, so it doesn't mean shit now. But then there was a big difference. So Uriah Heep were like my heroes when I was a kid. I had Demons and Wizards, and I loved them. And so I never actually, for me, it was like, for me, it was really special to end up playing alongside Mickey Box and and trying to fill Ken's shoes. And it was difficult. It was difficult as well to try and fill Ken's shoes because Ken Hensley was God rest his soul, was a powerhouse in terms of writing as a player. And I was a huge admirer of his, and he had a really high voice, and I didn't. So, actually replacing Ken, in a sense, in Uriah Heep. I mean, I don't know if that's an area you want me to go into. Do you want me to talk? Shall I?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Well, it was difficult because I think to sum it up, Peter, to a certain extent, I think we may have been better looking at Abominog and looking at Head First and Equator, which we'll talk about. We can talk about that. But those two albums, especially Abominog, I'd have to say, I often get the feeling it would have been better off to be called something else other than Uriah Heep, because it was really, I get it, when you get a lot of people say, well, look, this is the classic lineup: David Byron, Ken Hensley, Mick Box, Lee Kerslake, Gary Thane, end of story. I don't know how you call that Uriah Heep. And I don't know what it is, but I don't like it. It sounds like 80s stadium rock and all this type of thing, which it kind of was. It was at that period when synthesizers were coming to the fore, Foreigner, Survivor, and all these bands, Loverboy, everything was like this power pop thing. And of course, Ashley Howe was very much an influence in that direction, and he knew what he was doing in that direction. So he was steering us in that direction. But of course, if we hadn't carried on the name, and of course we had the connection through Mickey Box and through Lee Kerslake, but Bob Daisley, Pete Golby, and myself were not anything to do with the original lineup. And of course, the style totally changed. So I get it when people say, that's not Uriah Heep, that's not Demons and Wizards, what is that stuff they're doing? But at the same time, unfortunately, it was something we had to live up to, and people still expected us to go out and play the Wizard and play Easy Living because it was called Uriah Heep. That's what they'd come to see. So I get that. But China, the best I could do, was try and emulate Ken to some extent with the Hammond organ and the synth and so forth, but I certainly couldn't sing his parts because he had an incredible high voice, and I don't have that high falsetto voice that Ken had, and that was a big part of the Heep sound. So I admit I had to fake it to a certain extent, so I used Mellotron. on stage, which was tapes of voices. And so when you listen to old recordings and you hear this sort of big blast of sort of like oohs and ahs in the background, quite often it's actually bullshit. But bear in mind, it was pretty organic because it was before samplers. Would have been pretty easy with samplers, but this was the old days. This was tapes. I was using tapes.
Yeah.
To try and at least cover something. I mean, I could play a bit. I could do a sort of try and do my best Ken Hensley impression and play Easy Living and so forth, and play July Morning and enjoy it because I love those songs. But I mean, I could never really do what Ken did, because I mean, Ken wrote them. And Ken, Ken sort of originated that stuff. So nobody could play it quite like him. But I did my best. And so to a certain extent, it was great to go out on the road with a band that had a profile. And it meant we could go to the States and we could sort of like play to 1,500 people. Well, if we were called Harry and the Spiders or some shit, I mean, you're not going to get 1,500 people. But if you called Uriah Heep, that's a different story. And so, of course, we kept the name and we had the credibility to some extent, to a large extent, because Lee was still there. Lee was a great singer. Lee made it sound like Uriah Heep because his voice was a big part of the old days. Mickey was there, and of course, his style of guitar playing made it sound a lot like Uriah Heep. I could do my best impression. Pete on it I don't know, I've never really talked to Pete about it. It must have been quite difficult because he was a very different singer from David Byron. And I love David Byron, but Pete was a different type of singer.
And he had a kind of an 80s feel, didn't he? Because he was, he reminds me of a singer out of Australia called John Farnham. I don't know if
I know.
He had a song called You're the Voice. And he's got that wonderful tonality that is perfect for AOR or American-orientated rock. So I think he was probably perfect for that era.
For sure. And that's why it clicked, Peter. That's why it clicked. And so when Ashley Howe got the raw ingredients together, I was kind of another generation. I kind of grew up almost with a Moog synthesizer, so it was kind of part of my background. And then, of course, so I used a lot. My thinking was a lot more synthesizer-y, probably than Ken's was. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. And that's where that few years made a difference. You know what I'm saying? But I was totally down with the idea that, this doesn't really sound like Uriah. It doesn't really sound like, the original Uriah Heep albums. I understand that every band goes through sort of a metamorphosis from one style to another. Every band might change a bit. You may even change a singer, like AC/DC. But essentially, when Brian Johnson came in, he was virtually a sort of like, the next best thing to Bon Scott. And he did much the same thing. But I think it was quite different for us because Pete wasn't that type of singer. And that's obviously is the spearhead of the band. The sound of the band. You know what I'm saying? So, of course, it's going to change the sound of the band immensely if you've got a different style of singer, But I loved him. I love David Byron too. I love David Byron.
Absolutely. You would have noticed at Abominog there was an uptick in sales because the last two albums of Heep in the 70s, they were on the wane. So there was definitely this new band seemed to re-energize Uriah Heep. I want to take it back to the first time you guys were in a room and rehearsed or played. Can you describe that? Was it magic right off the bat?
I don't know. I was probably drunk. I'm trying to think. I usually was in those days. It's one of the reasons why.
Did it sort of click straight away? Do you remember?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Yeah. I think it fell together because I didn't. They already knew that. I think they'd already auditioned Pete or worked with Pete. Pete was already on the table kind of thing, or on the cards. Lee contacted me when I lived in LA because he'd been out and stayed with me. I think he said to Mickey, "Look, that bloke from the Heavy Metal Kids, that guy, he's living in LA." And Lee had stayed in touch with me. Lee and I used to write together. We'd just become pals from that tour when we supported. And he just called up and said, "Look, we're putting Heep back together. Are you up for it?" And I was doing nothing. I was broke. Yeah. I was sitting in LA. I'd gone out to LA. That's another story. But I mean, that whole thing had gone to shit. I mean, and really hadn't sort of amounted to anything. And I wasn't doing anything. So when he said, this is like kind of like, I don't know, really early 80s, 81, something like that. And he said, how do you fancy reforming Uriah Heep? I was like, how do you fancy sort of like putting a new lineup together as Uriah Heep? I was like, whoa, I couldn't think of anything. I was really excited. So when we got together, it was a real buzz, because I think we knew we already got on because we toured together. And I knew Mickey was great, and I knew Lee and Mickey were really close. So I think they came and picked me up in a Cortina. We went to a rehearsal, and we just started playing. We got a Hammond set up, and I got it sounding as heapy as I could. And we just sort of like blasted through some riffs, and we looked at each other, and it was kind of like, this is going to work, isn't it? And Pete was just great. And I heard Pete's voice. I thought, shit, geez, this guy's some singer,
He's got a good set of pipes.
Yeah, and then from there we kind of just gravitated to the studio. Then I met up with Ashley Howe and got Ashley's vision of what the band was going to be about. Because at that time, we did some early demos, which wound up sort of like on. I've often thought, am I going to get in trouble for this? Because we had some early demos, which I just thought were like of no consequence. And it was just some riffs and bits and pieces and sort of like, and they ended up on YouTube. And they're literally just rough mixes of just sort of like organ, backing tracks with Pete sort of like, really just trying some stuff out. And they had names. I mean, they had names, these songs. I think one of the riffs and something, I actually thought, well, it's not going anywhere. It's quite a good riff. And I think I came up with it on Lee's piano at his house. And I thought, well, might as well use that. And I think it went into an Ozzy song. And I thought, shit, when all this stuff started to emerge again, I thought, oh, am I going to be in trouble for this or what? But I didn't know that this stuff was going to, I just thought, well, a good riff is a good riff, so why not? Yep. But no, in answer to your question, Peter, we just got together, and it was just, we just got in the pub, we got into rehearsals, and every aspect of it was just magical. We just thought, is this going to really work? We got a bunch of guys. Nobody's so far up their own arse that you can't work with them. Everybody's great fun. Everybody can like pull their weight. There's really, and it was only and it was just the idea of sort of like going on and playing. For me, it was almost like stars in their eyes. It was like sort of going along and saying, tonight, Matthew, I'm going to be Ken Hensley. And going on and fulfilling your wildest dream of going out and actually playing July Morning and Gypsy and shit like that. But you never dream you'd ever get to do,
Yeah, not a bad way to pass an evening. Absolutely. Hey, on Abominog, there were 5 band songs and 5 covers. Why so many covers?
I think it was, do you know what happened? We were just looking for, you've got to bear in mind that the style of Abominog, Ashley Howe was a very, very important component in that album. And he was largely kind of sort of like giving the green light. And we were to a certain extent going, okay. And sometimes it didn't work for everybody. Bob Daisley, I think in his book, he's documented saying he hated On the Rebound because it was just sort of like, whereas to me, it was only ever meant to be a bit of fun. It wasn't ever meant to be like heavy metal or anything else. I think, and the style wasn't really formulated by anybody, but Ashley was definitely pushing it into the American sort of power pop direction. And we started to get a sense early on that with that cover, bizarrely enough, had an influence on me in that it was kind of, first of all, you look at it and you think, well, that's heavy metal. It's got to be, given Iron Maiden, Eddie, the monster face and so forth. But then you realise there's something about it. Actually, it only is actually a little monkey and it's smiling. And actually, it was almost not so much a parody of heavy metal, but almost to a certain extent a pastiche, if you like, and there's a difference, it was almost a tribute to heavy metal, and I remember coming up with the idea. Okay, we're going to be absolutely balls out metal. I mean, for instance, it doesn't matter. I never focus much on who did what, but okay, we're going to do stand up, shout it out. That was like that came. It was so ridiculous, sort of like an absolute fist in the air metal. But at the same time, it was kind of it had its tongue in its cheek. If you know what I'm saying, it wasn't supposed to be. You weren't trying to be metal per se. It was a tribute to sort of heavy metal, but the band was also leaning strongly into the power pop direction. Well, of course, Pete Golby, the way Pete writes, I mean, listen to Pete's songs and listen to the raw material. I mean, those songs like Chasing Shadows, Too Scared to Run and so forth, I mean, they're Pete's songs. Pete will probably tell you, I had input. My input was very much more from a production point of view. I mean, that's not to say I didn't put bits in here and there, but they were his songs. I mean, they were his songs. And I just sort of like, we just clicked to the point where he said to me, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to do this? How are we going to make this happen? You know, and we got that kind of level of trust going. And so that's why Pete and I became close because, you know, I'd never try and claim, you know, that I was writing those songs, but at the same time, he trusts. It might be just I'll say, okay, let's change the key there, but the part's already there. So you can say, well, that's not really the song, but nevertheless, it's sort of like, you know, all the time you're adding kind of something to the bringing something to the table, which enhances the song.
But it was a band co-write, wasn't it? Like it was a band of brothers. It wasn't. Everyone had a co-write on the album, didn't they?
Yeah, and that was the idea, really. Yeah. That was the idea, really, and that's where it got a bit complicated. Because if you know anything about the history, I was in a band called Lion. We did a song "Running All Night with the Lion," which is essentially my song. When I came to Heep, I played the song and I said, "Look, it's this riffy song. It's pretty good, I think. You know, it's a kind of like chucked it on the table." I didn't really stand to gain. In terms of like my ego or my profile, because I knew 5 names were going on it anyway. Yeah. But it had already been the stupidest and the funniest part about it was when I was in this band Lion in the States, we had the same deal. Yeah. So that got really stupid then when I brought a song in and they said, yeah, but we got a 5-way split. And I said, yeah, but I did write it and I kind of gave it to the band. So that was a bit silly, but it wasn't, you know, to be honest, there was nothing significant enough to worry about. And so for the most part, it's only really the Heat version that people even know about. Yeah. But the album was called Running All Night and the band was called Lion. So, you know, I just thought, well, last time I saw it, it was like selling for about $1 in the sort of like in a bargain rack somewhere. And it didn't do shit. And so I thought, well, that's dead. So, you know, that's all over. So we might as well. In terms of why we picked the other songs, they were just literally, Ashley was just finding the best songs he could. Yeah. And he was bringing them to the table. I think Jerry, I don't know, I didn't have that much association really with Jerry Bron, but I think Ashley had more, obviously as the producer, had more dealings with Jerry Bron than I did. And so Jerry Bron obviously had a sort of some say, or a lot of say, in what songs went in and what didn't. But Ashley would largely bring the songs in. I mean, we would sit and listen to what was happening and say, you know, that's the kind of thing we want to do. It might be Foreigner. I mean, Mark Lang would obviously come into the picture because he was so current, and Foreigner 4 was such a big album at the time. And we would sit and listen and think, well, okay, we're still Uriah Heep, but to a certain extent, that's the way things are progressing. And there were only so many songs, I suppose, that we had. Strangely, looking back and having got to know Pete, if I'd have known more about Pete and probably been closer and worked closer to Pete, between he and I, we could have probably found more out of his back catalogue than we actually used, to be honest.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then the album would have been more cohesive in those terms, and it would have been genuinely, at least originated from, you know, those 5 members.
Yeah. Well, the album certainly got a lot of notice in, you know, the music press. It was quite favourable comparative to the other Heat albums. Just one more question about the recording process. Is your recollection, was it a long recording process, or was it fairly speedy?
It was. I think it was pretty long. I think we spent quite a long time. I spent a really
Right.
long, long
A lot of
nights.
takes, a lot of takes, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, it was quite detailed. I mean, it was really, really. Once we built up that level of trust in Ashley,
yep,
I obviously sort of trusted Ashley by definition because I knew that he'd worked with Heep before. And so I instantly had a kind of a faith in him that he knew what Heep was about. He knew what Heep could get away with in terms of pushing the boundaries. He probably didn't really. He was probably just a sort of like, he was probably just testing the water as much as any of us were. But at the same time, because he'd worked with them before, I was still a new boy, so I trusted his judgment for the most part.
yeah,
He was very into the American thing. I thought when I came in that it was going to be we were going to be like, one of the new wave of British heavy metal bands, as they called it, except that we were going to be the real thing because we were Uriah Heep, and Uriah Heep was sort of mega in like 1973 with the Live in Birmingham album and so forth, and Uriah Heep had been top of the game, and so we weren't Iron Maiden or one of the sort of new wave of British heavy metal. We were the old wave of British heavy metal making a resurgence, but that's not really what happened. That's not really. That's what I thought I was joining. I thought I'd have to come in and try and write songs and try and think, well, what would Ken write? Really, because I thought that's what I was joining.
you had that mindset of putting yourself in the shoes of how
Ken.
The previous. In respect of your keyboard lines, were you given free license to do what you wanted, or was it
totally.
very structured?
No, not at all. It was like that was just given free license to do anything I liked, really. And to be honest, I mean, while you touch on that, Peter, it's funny because through that whole period, it wasn't until this is another whole subject, and I won't go too far down this rabbit hole, but it wasn't until I quit the business in 2003, I actually realised I was never actually a keyboard player. It wasn't really my primary interest. I should have been. It was the only thing I knew. I was very, very self-conscious and didn't have a lot of confidence when I grew up. And I started getting piano lessons when I was 5, and I became a keyboard player. But by the time I was 12, I was already thinking, F this. It's boring, I mean? Who wants to be stuck here? I want to be up front with the guitar, and I want to be like, I want to impress the girls. I really didn't want to be stuck behind keyboards. So if you look at what I did, I mean, the only people that really interested me were like the likes of Keith Emerson, because he was such a showman. And so to a certain extent, and I have to say this, and I don't mind saying it, I don't mind it going on the internet for the rest of eternity. I never thought I was that good, to be honest, because it wasn't really my interest. But what I tried to do, and hopefully pulled off, was just do what was needed. When it came to the keyboard bits, people perceived me as the keyboard player, and a lot of people seemed to like my work, but I wasn't very impressed. I was never very impressed with it, to be honest. And so I was listening to the guitar mainly. I'd be in the studio, but then when you go on stage, of course, you're the keyboard player. So what are you going to do? You got to play keyboards.
I mean, some of your arrangements, like on Head First, are just amazing. Like Roll in the Rock and all that sort of stuff is just fantastic.
Yeah, but that's backroom stuff. You can't go on stage with leather trousers and a huge knob and impress the girls with that because it's all been done. It's all backroom stuff. And so then you got to get on stage where you can't overdub, you can't do any of the tricks. You've just got to fucking play. You just got to play. That's all you got. You got to play live, and somehow you've got to recreate all that shit that you did live, and that's really hard because I go on stage. How the hell am I going to pull this off? So now you can see why I was using tapes. I was using anything I could to try and pull it off. I couldn't do it live. It's really hard. I mean, so in the studio I'll be absolutely immersed, but of course I tried to believe that I was as into keyboards and I was as much the keyboard player as everybody else perceived me. But my perception of myself, it wasn't until I was able to actually sort of like withdraw from the business and look at it and think, actually, it was never really my thing. Probably should have been a producer. I probably should have been the guy sitting that nobody ever sees, actually making the decisions, because I'm better at that.
Yeah.
And I enjoy it more. I enjoy it more.
Well, you kind of fooled me and a lot of other fans, because your sounds, your keyboard sounds are just integral to that lineup, especially Headfirst and Abominog. So, hey, I've got a question for you. So, you finished the album, you finished recording. Tell us, what was your initial impression when you heard the album for the first time?
Abominog.
Abominog, yeah. What was your first impression?
We were really proud of what we'd done. We were really proud of what we'd done, Peter. I've got to say, it was really an exciting time because, on my experience, one of the gigs we did ended up in Spinal Tap. You know that. We did the Air Force Base.
I will talk about that.
We're going to talk about that. So to a certain extent, the fact that we were the lineup, and I wasn't privy to what had gone on with Heep beforehand. I'd seen John Sloman. He seemed he seemed to be a really good singer. But all I knew was that a lot of those lineups didn't really click. I was aware of the fact that a lot of money had been spent trying to put a new lineup together of Heep. And the fact is, we could, to a certain extent, pride ourselves on the fact that we were the lineup that seemed to have pulled it off and actually sort of like made Heep more than just a sort of like, to quote Spinal Tap, in the Where Are They Now file, which seemed to be where he had wound up. So our combination and the efforts we'd made, and then we got the reviews, incredible, some really, really stunning reviews on Abominog. Yes. And at that point, for any artist, you think, well, it's not just me and my mates and my Auntie Nellie that thinks it's good. The world's starting to think it's good. Biased rock journalists, they like it. And Uriah Heep had a record of getting shit from the British music press, but they like this. Yeah. And then we did the Donington gig, which was like a big one for us. And hearing the album, thinking, our combination, putting us five guys falling together into that room and doing this is where we've ended up. So it was an incredible experience. That was kind of all wrapped up in the listening of that album and thinking, shit, it all works, doesn't it? I think we've got something. I think we really have got something.
Absolutely, and that's the way it is. Started to get some airplay on MTV. It was charting in America. I guess there was a lot of positivity in the band, thinking that
it's hilarious.
To happen.
I saw it not long ago. It's hilarious. Those 80s videos just crack me up now. It's like such bullshit. It's like you can't. We didn't have a clue. And you've got to bear in mind. You've got to also bear in mind they didn't have any videos. So to give we can pride ourselves on having a video that went on fairly hot rotation on MTV. But you do have to bear in mind the fact that MTV were looking for videos and didn't have much to play. And it was a great song. And presumably we were reasonably presentable. When I look at it now, this cracks me up now when I look at that video. I just remember that day when we filmed it. It was like, we just said, turn up here, and there's all these girls turned up, started putting motorbike. We didn't even ride the bikes. I don't think any of us could actually ride a Harley. So when you see us roaring off on these things, it's not us. It's probably the girls. I don't know.
Not even Bob Daisley. He looks like he'd be capable of riding a Harley. Hey,
he might. I've never asked him. I know I couldn't. I'd probably get breathalyzed if I got on a Harley in those days. Yeah. It was nothing to do with me. So we didn't have a clue. We didn't have a clue what the point of any of it was. The first video I'd ever done. So we just turned up at some horrible place at 5 a.m. It was freezing cold and did what we were told. Yeah. And then saw the end result.
What was the tour like in doing the first US tour? Was that fantastic?
Yeah, it really was, because I can't remember. The first one wasn't the Def Leppard tour. It wasn't the Pyromania tour. We got on that afterwards, as I recall. my memories are a bit fuzzy because I was always pissed in those days.
Yeah, it's all right.
That's another story. But I mean, I was out of it. Everybody liked the drink, but I was beyond that. I mean, I was in trouble. And so my memories can be a bit hazy at that time. But we were playing big clubs. I mean, we were playing big clubs in Houston. It was a long tour.
The audiences were responding to the material
and
really, really good.
Yeah. And it seemed as though we were just, we were getting a combination of sort of like dedicated older Heep fans, literally turned out to see the Heep classics, and hopefully we were delivering them well enough. And I suppose a whole new generation of kids that were watching MTV and wanted to see the band that was played on the video. I guess, but generally speaking, no, they were really good. The reactions were really good. The vibe was really good. Being on the road was great fun. I mean, there's no bullshit with, the band. I mean, it was just a really, really we had the best fun. I mean, long drives. I'm not sure if it was that first tour, but I know we clocked 65,000 miles by bus on one of those tours. 65,000 miles, because we didn't, we still having to watch the pennies, and that brings us to the Air Force Base, I suppose. But we still had to be very careful because we had to pay for the bus, and we certainly weren't mega standards, so we had to be careful what we were doing, to sort of like keep it afloat. But it was old school, it was like a bunch of guys just out there with a good album behind you, and just one place to another, and just sort of like. And really, really knocking them out every night. It was great fun, amazing.
Absolutely. Any recollections of Castle Donington the day, if any? Other than big crowds and...
About it, really. It was about it, really. I mean, Donington's always a pretty amazing experience. I've done, I don't know how many I did with Ozzy. But of course, it's just, once again, that's different, Being Uriah, I mean, as a performer, I mean, if your main reason to be is to be a performer, which of course I was in Uriah Heep, of course that will be the difference. With Ozzy, of course, a lot of the time I was behind the curtain, so technically you're doing the show and you're playing your bits, but I mean, really, being a sideman is a very different vibe.
Yeah, understand.
Well, there's nothing against the Oz. That's just the way it is. I mean, it's like, people are going to... Yeah, to quote the song, it's like, I don't expect... heavy metal fans, I mean, for the most part, I used to think that if I wasn't Ozzy's keyboard, probably the fact that I was Ozzy's keyboard player was the only reason I was allowed to live, I think. Sort of like, apart from that, I should have been put to death. You know what I'm saying? Sort of having synthesizers and all that shit. Not with Heep, but with Ozzy. I mean, really hardcore metal fans, they take a lot of convincing that you even need a keyboard player.
Yeah.
In a lot of cases, they may be right. You may be well right.
Well, I guess there's a lot of fans like, the folk that like Deep Purple and a lot of those other bands that are very keyboard. They love that sort of sound, and Heep are right in that wheelhouse. Just want to quickly talk about...
But you're verging on, just to draw a line under that, you're verging on prog rock, really, even when you talk about Deep Purple. I mean, Deep Purple, sort of like, when you think about Ian Pace and the way they play, John Lord and so forth, I mean, it might not be as proggy, say, yes, but at the same time, it's still a lot more sort of like, it's still a lot more kind of, I don't know, intricate. I don't know what the word would be, but it's a lot more intricate music.
All that neoclassical stylings.
Exactly, neoclassical, exactly,
You used to bring a lot of classical, neoclassical to Heep, a few flourishes. Where did that come from? Where did that inspiration come from, John?
Probably Clockwork Orange. It was Walter, back in the days, before Walter became Wendy, I used to listen to Walter Carlos.
Switched on Bach.
Yes. Yeah, switched on Bach, and I was fascinated with the idea of just, how when the synthesizer came out and you could actually sort of like make a noise like a horn of some sort or something like strings, Actually, there was nothing like it at the time, but it sounded pretty good. Considering it was, you see that it came out of a keyboard. And so the idea of like mucking around with a 4-track tape machine and layering those and see if you could at least emulate, you know, what a section would sound like, I was fascinated. I was quite taken with that. But I was more taken with that than I was with, once again, more taken with that, the intricacies and the possibilities that presented than, say, actually playing. That was you're almost looking more at the sort of like the technology, you're almost looking at it more from an academic point of view of what's possible than you are of actually being a keyboard player. So even though I've got a Bechstein grand piano sitting over there, I hardly ever just sit down and play because I'm not really interested. I never have been.
Yeah.
And that's a weird one. It's a weird one.
It is. So with Head First, was this a push from the record label to get back in, boys, and we've got to pump another one out, or was it a band decision?
No, it was pretty much. I don't even know what we were contracted to do. I would imagine it was a 3-album deal. And so it's a natural extension as soon as we could to get in and do more of the same but different, as they say.
Were you happy with the results? Were you happy with the results of Head First? Did you like that album?
Yeah, I did. I mean, that's my. I'm sure I'm probably not on my own when I say my order would go Abominog, Head First, and then finally Equator in terms of preference, without a doubt.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, it was a downhill. I can't say we reached our peak in the middle. I think we peaked first. But Head First was still a great. I mean, there's stuff on Head First, Rolling the Rock, and these tracks that spring to mind were really good tracks. I thought Lonely Nights was a great track. I mean, it was like, but when you look at Lonely Nights and you think what a pop song that is, you realise how far down that rabbit hole we'd gone in terms of pop music. I don't know if we'd gone too far, but there was nobody in the band that really objected.
Yeah, I interviewed Bob Daisley earlier this year, and
he might have been though.
I think he expressed some frustration about the management and how he thought that he really loved the band, but he was frustrated that it just didn't seem to maybe have been mismanaged, and it didn't think it was going to go very far. What did you ever have recollections of Bob or any other members of the band where you're starting to get a bit frustrated with management and things not sort of working out like you would have expected?
A lot of it. I mean, to a certain extent, Pete and I were, we stayed on we always used to think, well, there's a definite line and you're on one side of the line, you're in the band and you're really sort of like, mushrooms kept in the dark and fed bullshit, as we would say. And on the other side, there's the business side, and that works completely independently. You're either over that line or you're not. And, in terms of the coordinator or the mediator for what was over that line, of course, we just left that largely to Mickey, because Mickey was the oldest, and longest member of Uriah Heep. Lee was away a lot of the time, because I think he was tax exiled then, so he was living in the Canary Islands. I was sharing a flat with Mickey in East London, so I was with Mick a lot of the time, because obviously I didn't have a permanent place in London while I was over. But I just left it to him. I thought, well, he knows what's going on. Mickey knows what's going on. He knows these people. I know there was a lot of frustration. Particularly by the Equator period. And that was, I'd have to say, with the change of producer and with the sort of disastrous management we had in the Equator period, that's probably, probably led to, probably was detrimental to that album, I'd have to say. Because by then the morale was really low by that point.
With Bob leaving the band to rejoin Ozzy and Trevor Bolder coming in, was that a big shock to the band with Bob leaving and put things a couple of steps back?
I don't know. They were both, generally speaking. I mean, Bob was an amazing lyricist, But Bob generally was not I mean, I'm not talking out of turn here, but I mean, Bob's a friend of mine. But Bob's not a person who would come in with songs, you know. I mean, I think he'd be the first to tell you that. You know, he didn't sit at home writing songs as such, you know. A lyric is, you know, his contribution lyrically to Ozzy, to Heep, is astounding. I mean, in terms of his reputation. I don't know. I don't know really. You tend in a band. You tend not to. We tend to just carry on. You just carry on. I mean, you tend to just carry on with whatever's there on Monday morning when you turn up. You don't really think. You don't really overthink it. You know. So I knew Trevor. Trevor was great, and I love Trevor. He's a great guy. I came in. He's a great bass player. And shit, he's in the Spiders from Mars. You know, what more do you need to know? All right, let's crack on. That's really as that's about as much as you think, you know, as much as you think about it. You don't sort of really analyse Trevor. You wouldn't really think about analysing Trevor's playing. How does that, what would Bob have done? You don't get that far, you know, you just think, well, it is what it is now.
Yeah.
And Bob's decision to leave was his decision. Trevor had been in the band and Trevor was great, so we just crack on, you know.
So you had Tony Platt produce the Equator album, and a definite change of direction. It was just heavily drenched in synth and sequences. Did this take a long time to record? Because it sounds like everything but the kitchen sing's thrown in this particular album. Was this a long recording process?
Do you know, I can't answer that. I can't honestly say how long we did. And I remember we worked at Jacobs. Do you know what, Peter? I was so pissed by that period. I was so depressed. I was going through a lot of personal problems as well. I was so fucking drunk. Sorry about that. I was so drunk by that point. I can't honestly answer how long it took.
Yeah.
But I know for me, it was like one of the, you know, it was one of, I mean, Pete used to say, you okay? You know, I was in a really bad way by then. I was trying to keep going, doing what I did, but I was struggling really badly. And so in terms of Equator, by then I personally had pretty much lost the plot. And
so
I would do
you
whatever.
might have checked out. You were checking out a little bit.
I think so.
Yeah.
And so all I remember was they brought in this synclavier, which I didn't know anything about. And a lot of the sounds on Equator didn't necessarily come from me at the time. I didn't object to them, but I mean, in retrospect, they're probably not sounds I'd have even chosen. But that very much was Tony's influence of using this thing. You know, this is like the new big thing, this synclavier, and so you know we got to use it. I couldn't even switch it on. I didn't know what it was. It was like, you know, but it was there, and it made some amazing noises. So it was sort of like, wow, that's cool, isn't it? Okay, stick that on something then. But it didn't really have the same kind of background. By then, I was not in the right headspace, and certainly not in the right level to really control. I think basically I'd lost control. I think I'd lost control of what was going on by then. Yeah. I was still working with Pete in the same way, and I think you can hear that. I think you can hear that in some of the material. Songs like Poor Little Rich Girl, we were still sort of, you know, I don't want to say collaborating song-wise, because it would be Pete's song. But we just had the kind of arrangement where Pete said, okay, what are we going to eat? He played to me on an acoustic guitar, which is basically how he wrote. And he'd say, and I might sort of embellish this or embellish that, do a few bits. And we just had a level of trust going on that level. I trusted him to sort of like come up with the most amazing top lines, amazing songs. And then he seemed to trust me to just sort of like hand it over and say, okay, how do you want to do it? And then from there, it would go to Ashley and, okay, how is this going to wind up on the tape? Yeah, that seemed to be the routine. Was like, you know, Pete would come up with it, you know, I would sort of like mess with it, and Ashley would then do everything he put everything on the table he could do to make it sound amazing and come out the speakers.
There's some pretty decent songs on the album. The album got a fair amount of criticism in the day that technology just took over and sort of drowned a lot of the songs. Do you think that's fair?
I agree with that. I'd go with that. Fair enough. Yeah, I'd go with that. You know, it's certainly something. Looking back, it's certainly something I didn't advocate. But at the same time, you know, I take full responsibility for the fact that I wasn't in a place to really be kind of strong enough or objective enough to object to it.
Yeah.
I wasn't in a strong enough place to say, this isn't, guys, you know, we're not doing another Abominog here. This is not, I'm not sure that any of us could by that stage. I'm not sure any of us were objective enough. I mean, our management situation, the whole arrangements, you know, we weren't getting any money. We were just being completely ripped off.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just, you know, such a horrible situation. I mean, I was living in LA, and I'll keep it brief. My missus was attacked, my ex-wife was attacked in LA, and her face was smashed to pieces. I had to bring her back to London. I was sleeping on my mother's floor, and we weren't even getting paid. My mother was feeding us. This is the situation. So the shit that was going on, and I wouldn't like it recorded for posterity. Some of the shit that happened, you know, in terms of being ripped off at that time. But I mean, that's some horrible stories. Well, all that, if you put all that into the mix, and then think, you know, from being a band of sort of like 5 happy chappies, we got together and just clicked with Ashley, and we did Abominog, and it just all happening, and everything just fell into place. It just unfortunately deteriorated to the point whereby I don't think anybody was in control of it anymore.
Sure. Hey, you did 2 tours of Australia, one around the Head First era and one at Equator. Do you have any memories of touring Australia?
Yeah. Well, through the haze, yeah. I remember some of it. I remember the tours. That was good stuff. No, one of the things I really loved, I mean, one of the things, we had an amazing time. I think we landed in Australia, and me and Mickey Box were in adjacent seats on the plane, and I think the first time in my life on a single flight, I think I wound up. I actually woke up arrived after having 3 different hangovers on one flight, and we got into Australia, put our bags in the hotel, and went straight down the pub. Not like we're not jet lagged already. I mean, talk about. That was, but we had a great time. One of the things I remember, King's Cross in those days, I met some people from Australia because we do a B&B in the house here. So I met some Australians, stayed with us, and they said King's Cross, like, you know this, it's a bit off track, but they said King's Cross is quite different now. But I loved King's Cross. I just thought it was the best. So you could check into the hotel in King's Cross, and you could build a nest for a couple of weeks. And of course, then you could go and do like 15, 20 gigs and not move because they were all within 150 miles of the centre of Sydney. And you've never seen that before. Normally it's, you know, out of the hotel, next hotel and so forth. So that was amazing. And King's Cross was such a vibe. I mean, in those days, I mean, it was just incredible. I mean, you could just go out for a walk and just have a great time. Yeah. Apparently it's different now, is that right?
It is. It's not the red light district. You guys played the pubs and the club.
So a great time. I mean, overall, we loved it. We loved it. I mean, if you can survive the flight, I mean, just the best time ever. I loved it. I mean, we had a great time in Australia. We really did. We even went to Alice Springs. I mean, we ended up in Alice Springs. We said, "Oh, go! We're in Alice Springs. Got to go and see Ayers Rock." So I woke up the next morning and said, you do know it's about 300 miles or something from Alice Springs.
Right. Was that the whole band or just you? You and
yeah, well, no. I wouldn't go on my own, would I? I'd be lucky to get in the van on my own. I was like, no, we're all there. I think we did a gig there. We played in Alice Springs, I think. What else would we be doing there? I must have done a gig there. But I know
if you've got a bootleg of Uriah Heep in Alice Springs, please, send it through to me. I'd love to see that. I've got to talk about Spinal Tap. So, true or not, did you play the keyboards for Spinal Tap, like the soundtrack?
Do you know what? I can't answer that because what happened? I did the pilot. I mean, do you want pretty much the Spinal Tap story? I mean,
let's go. Let's do the Spinal Tap.
Well, you can always cut out. Some of this bullshit. Just cut it out. I was in the studio. I think I was working with the Babies in LA. I was doing sessions for Ron Nevison who was quite a well-known LA producer and did some big name back in the day. Anyway, I was doing some sessions, and a guy said, "Look, we're all pretty broke." And this guy came up and said, "Look, this guy's doing a movie about an English rock band. Are you up for it? You're looking for a keyboard player?" So I said, "Okay." And so he gave me this number. So I had no idea who I was calling. So I called this number in Century City in LA. And it was Rob Reiner. Well, of course, I was being a Brit. I didn't know anything about the Not for Primetime Players. I didn't know these guys were comedians. These guys were all in character in this office. And so I went in there and I just met them. And I just thought they were a bunch of guys. And they talked pretty much like me. Well, pretty much like as I would imagine from London. And Rob Reiner was there, and I'd never seen All in the Family, so I didn't realise he was a well-known comedian. I didn't know any of these guys were. And so they said, I chatted away and I played them some stuff, and they said, "Yeah, you sound like you're the right sort of bloke for what we're doing." And I said, "Oh, great." And so I think I got $1,200 for doing it. They were broke. It was a pilot. It was the pilot. And literally, yeah. We did I got the gig and I turned up and we rehearsed, and they still didn't fill me in on what was happening. I knew I was getting $1,200 and I needed it, but I still didn't know what I was doing. And I'm listening to these songs, and I'd go home at night to my ex-wife and I'd say, "Do you know, I've done some bollocks, I've done some bullshit in my life for this band. You would not believe these songs. Big Bottom, right? Talk about mud flaps, my girl's got them. This fucking thing, Stonehenge, sort of like, I said, they're out of their minds." I said, but I just thought, well, I'm getting paid. What can I tell you? So I went along, did the best I could. I think Tonight We're Gonna Rock You. When we recorded that, I turned up at the studio. By then we rehearsed. Turned up at the studio and they said to me, "Okay, we want you to put an organ solo on this one." I said, "What one?" I said, "This track." I said, "I haven't heard it." They said, "No, but you will do." And there was an organ, a Hammond organ sitting in the studio. I said, "You want me to put a solo?" They said, "Well, just go down and just bluff it." I said, "Are you kidding me or what?" So I go down there. Admittedly, that was after they'd filled me in on what they were doing. They said, "We want it to sound desperate." And I was okay. So I went down, and it took me the first one. I finally figured out it was in A, and then from the control room, I went, "Go, go, go, go." So that was it. Anyway, to backtrack a bit, what happened after about a week of rehearsals or something like that, one day I walk into the rehearsal room, and they're all American. And that's when they actually sat me down and they said, "Here's the thing. It's a parody, it's a spoof. It's not supposed to be serious." And probably at that point I thought, thank God for that. Finally I understood what was going on. And then I kind of got the feeling at the time that they did it for two reasons. And one was simply to fuck with me. And the other one was, you can bleep that, can't you? So one was to sort of like, one was to fuck with me basically. The other thing was to see if I actually figured it out.
Yeah.
Because I could sit and listen to them, and if there was anything, see if I was suspicious in any way. And I've got to say, I really wasn't. I wasn't looking for that. I just thought they were. I just thought that Christopher Guest was, from London. And he would sit and say to me, and they'd push me. They'd say, "Do you know Squatney?" I'd be thinking, no, I didn't really, not really, no. And so, "Well, do you still live in London? Does your mum live in London?" I said, "Yeah, my mum lives there." "Oh, right. And so these conversations would take place, and it would literally be, I suppose, part of the kind of routining of what they were trying to do. Anyway, it was filmed, it was recorded, and it is on YouTube, half an hour. It's only about half an hour, but that was the pilot, which I think they kind of kept pretty under wraps for a long time, but it got out anyway. And it's called Spinal Tap, The Final Tour. And in that, I'm actually featured as the keyboard player. And we did the soundtrack and things like Stonehenge and so forth. I think I'm credited for musical stylings or something like that, which is an odd word. I'd never heard it before. That's how I'm credited in the movie. I'm not sure which of the versions ended up in the movie and which didn't.
But your keyboard is on the soundtrack somewhere.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely.
Wow.
If you actually go to YouTube and Spinal Tap the Final Tour, I mean, it's me playing. I'm probably miming in that, but I'm actually miming to the studio recordings we'd done. What ended up on the Spinal Tap album, I can't tell, because what happened in the case of things like Stonehenge is there's every chance that somebody may have emulated the same parts that I put into, say, Stonehenge. But what I can say is that I obviously, not blowing my own trumpet, I tend not to, but I originated those parts because you can hear the original in the Spinal Tap, the Final Tour.
Are you amazed Are you amazed that this movie's just gone on and on and on, and it's just become a cult classic? Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably, when I stopped doing interviews, Peter, I was probably asked more times, geez, did you really play on Stonehenge? And all this type of thing. You think all the shit that I sweated blood for was 50 years, and people want to know if I played on Stonehenge.
Yeah.
That isn't really why I got into the business. That's not what I wanted to be known for, on my gravestone. The guy who played on Stonehenge, Big Bottom.
John, do you look at that movie like a documentary or like a comedy? Because I remember Rob Halford in an interview said that he saw the movie and he just recognised all these different things that happened. It was like real life.
Ozzy said, I don't know what's funny about it. It's pretty much how it is. I'm not very much. I mean, we've done that. I mean, everybody's got lost under the stage. It was incredibly well. It was incredibly well researched and incredibly well done. And I've even seen, sort of wobblers, in the dressing room about sort of like, and it's sort of like it's nerves that brings it about, like with the meat not fitting the bread and things like that. I've experienced sort of like episodes over the years. Some of them might have come from me, I don't know. And it's like, so you think it's incredibly well researched. I mean, is that a good point to get to the Air Force? Air Force Base. So how that fits into the story? How that fits into the story? Anyway, better is hold on, my ears have fell apart. How that fits into the story is Christopher Guest said to me, "What's the worst gig you've ever done?" And so I said, "Well, we were touring." I said, "We had my recollection is we had a gig cancelled." And like I said, we were on a pretty tight budget because even though we were kind of riding on the crest of a little new wave in Uriah Heep history with the video and so forth, and everything was great, the tour was going great, we still needed to keep the gigs going because we needed to pay the bills. And so something was cancelled and we couldn't really afford to sort of have nights off and pay for hotels and justify paying for the bus and all that shit. We weren't working. So the agent said, "Well, I can put you into this. There's a gig. It's an Air Force base." We didn't think too much about it. We just thought, well, it's a gig, and it'll pay the bills. So, yeah, okay. So we took it. Well, we turned up at this place, and it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't on our schedule. It wasn't on our itinerary. We turned up at this place, and literally all the guys were in uniform. And all the girls were, it was like a very conservative looking, very straight-laced evening out. There's nothing wrong with that. All the women were in kind of like evening dress, and the guys were in uniform, and it was all over. And we went on stage with a house PA. We weren't travelling with the PA. We used to use the PA that was provided wherever we played. And you can imagine what it was like. I think they used it for bingo or something normally. So that was the PA. And so we set up our shit on this stage and just launched straight into Sell Your Soul off of Abominog, which is pretty down and dirty. And the whole crowd just hit the back wall. And it was just silence. And we just like, fucking hell. So we did the gig and we got off. I think afterwards the dressing room got trashed. I spoke to Bob not long ago. There was a placard outside, which was a bit concerning because when we arrived, there was a big orange placard and it said the Uriah Heep Show, right? And it was covered with like an orange placard surrounded by kind of silver glitter. And it second underneath, and it had a picture of Abominog, the Abominog cover, and it said underneath, second only to ABBA in popularity. Okay, I don't know where that came from. And it said over 100 million records sold, second only to ABBA in popularity, the Uriah Heep Show. And that should have sort of been a bit of a red flag before we started. I thought Bob kept that, but he said that he didn't. I spoke to him a while ago. I said, haven't you got that thing, you know? Anyway, that was it. It was just sort of, it was a one-off, but it was sort of definitely registered as being a fucking disaster.
At least you didn't support a puppet show or something.
No, it wasn't far off. It wasn't far off. But then when Christopher Guest said to me, what's the worst gig you ever did? It was that. So I described it in much the same way to him. And afterwards, you know, bless them, they for what it's worth, they credited, you know, me for actually bringing that to the table in terms of what wound up in the Spinal Tap movie. And they said it was actually.
That's a great scene. Hey, I can't not talk about your time with Ozzy. So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask a couple of questions. What was it like working with the Ozman?
Ozzy's great. Ozzy's amazing. He's as funny as he's actually as funny as you imagine he is. I mean, he's like, to me, I mean, I got, you know, over the years, 17 years sort of on and off, apart from a brief break when he was off the road and I went out on the road with the Colt. And then went back in with Ozzy. It was great. It was a great experience. So I joined in '86. Zach Wilde joined in '87. So that when we started working on soon after that we started working on the No Rest for the Wicked album. I actually joined to do the Ultimate Sin tour, and that was Jakey Lee was in the band in those days. But then by '87. We kind of knuckled down. The record company were after another album. So, and Zach came into the band. Zach was 19 then, and he was great. He was great fun. We had some great laughs. And once again, apparently, the story goes that Bob always said that how I got the gig with Ozzy. Ozzy said he was looking for a keyboard player. I don't think, you know, for what it's worth. I mean, you know, it's that in terms of sort of Ozzy's music. I mean, obviously, if you're a keyboard player, let's just say you've got the least to do of anybody. I mean, really, I mean, it's certainly not too much of a challenge. And apparently, the story goes, according to Bob, that he said to Ozzy, "Well, the guy I was working with in Uriah Heep, John Sinclair, I don't think he's doing anything, and he drinks nearly as much as you do." And the story goes, Ozzy said, "Right, he's in then."
Oh no!
Well, so that is a recipe for disaster.
That's a red flag.
Well, so I didn't really audition, Peter. I just turned up. I was it came through Daisley. It wasn't like it wasn't like I was applying for an audition. There wasn't a line of keyboard players. It was just like, well, okay, Daisley's worked with him, and Daisley puts his name forward. Then, I mean, you know,
must be a good bloke.
It must be all right. It must be able to cover what's needed, really. And I get that. You know, all I had to do was cover. I mean, if you can play Mr. Crowley, you pretty much got the gig. You know, there's not a lot else.
Absolutely. What was Ozzy like in the studio comparative to like outside on stage? Is he very focused in the studio?
Yeah. He comes. I mean, Ozzy's a really good writer. He doesn't really play an instrument as such. He plays harmonica, funnily enough. But no, he's just great fun. It's just Ozzy. He's just Ozzy. I mean, he's such a fun person. If you've seen the series, I mean, I don't think you can really script Ozzy. You can't say, learn this and you're going to go and play a part. So that's him.
You must have played in front of some fantastic audiences. Have you got any particular recollection of a concert or something that you want to share with the audience?
Yeah, South America was cute, like the biggest crowd probably I've ever seen. I was told it was around 500,000, something like that.
Wow.
Somewhere, it was one of the two. It was might have been Rio or Sao Paulo, one of the two. And amazingly enough, I remember, it was funny because I remember standing at the side of the stage looking at this crowd. I'd never seen or heard anything quite like that. I mean, including sort of like Donington festivals and so forth. And thinking it all started, everything throughout a 50-year career started with answering one advert in a music paper when I was a teenager. And I joined this band. And they supported the heavy metal kids. Heavy metal kids supported Uriah Heep. Uriah Heep had two of Ozzy Osbourne band members. They suggested I'd put me forward for Ozzy. I wound up joining Ozzy's band. And now I'm here because of that one phone call. And you realise that everything was absolutely interlinked. And I remember nearly not making the phone call and thinking, what would have happened if I hadn't made that phone call? Would I actually be standing here right now? And you just think, and it was one of the things I've often said to people over the years is you just never know how one thing's going to connect to another. So always take that chance, always make that move. If you're in doubt, just do it. Just do it, because just, for better or worse, it's incredible how things can just sort of just link, you know. And my experience, maybe it's getting a bit deep, my experience after 71 years on the planet is that a lot of the things that you sweat blood for don't fucking happen. And then other things which are seismic and life-changing just come out of nowhere.
Yep.
And happen in an instant. And you just go, where did that come from?
Yeah.
And that pretty much summed up everything that had happened to me. It's just click. Click, next, LA, next, this. Yep. And that's incredible. And yet all the things that you're trying to plan for and really work on, and it's such an uphill slog, you know, and then it doesn't happen at all. And then something else will happen. It just goes, click.
Uriah Heep, calling it a day. You know, if they called you up and said, hey, one for the road, would you stand behind the keyboard stand, do a song?
No, I don't.
No?
Oh, just have a go. Just have a play. I might do if I could remember it. I wouldn't think about a tour. I wouldn't have the energy.
No, not a tour, but like a one show. If it's got to finish, if it's got to finish, I would imagine that it will finish somewhere. If they had an all-star show and
I mean, I saw a thing online. Mickey said that it is the next year is they're on their last tour. I'm pretty sure that he's actually put that out there, that it's sort of like, you know, this is it now.
So would you be up for the finale if they asked you?
I don't know. Probably. I'd have to a whole show. I'd have to remember a whole show.
I really appreciate your time.
It's different. It's different. It's a different era, Peter. You know, it's a different place. You know, and that, you know, if anything comes out of this, I think it's just a shame in a way. We may have been better off, and it may have been fairer to the listeners and to the fans to have a different name.
Yeah.
And just call the band something else, and have two ex-Uriah Heep members as Mickey Box and Lee Kerslake. But, you know, other than that, you know, a combination of sort of different players. Me, Pete Golby from Trapeze, and Bob Daisley from everybody. We don't make it, you name it.
I think it's really important that we document this because, you know, those albums, there's a lot of fans, and I can tell you in my circles, they still listen to those albums and they still love it. I think it's very highly regarded in the Heep discography. So I really appreciate your time, John, you know, talking to this little channel from Australia, and wonderful tales talking about, you know, Spinal Tap and Ozzy. So I wish you the best of health, and you know, maybe one day we'll do something, another show down the track. I'm not sure, but
if you ever get
really appreciate.
If you ever get to the Scottish Highlands, I mean, give me a shout, Peter. It'd be great to meet.
Absolutely, I
IRL.
love that part of the world. Anyway,
all right, mate.
Rock Day Dream Nation. Thank you, John. All the
Okay,
best.
mate. You take care.
See you.